Chapter 1. Introduction. Why the 100 Years' War is Fascinating. Imagine a time when knights ride across the battlefield in shining armor, when archers darken the sky with thousands of arrows, and when kings defend their right to entire kingdoms with sword and crown. A time in which not only two armies faced each other, but two entire nations that fought in a bitter struggle for power, honor, and identity. This time was the 100 Years' War. It lasted from 1337 to 1453, more than a century. During this long span, Europe experienced not only countless battles, sieges, and peace treaties, but also epidemics, famines, civil wars, and religious upheavals. What began as a dynastic inheritance dispute developed into an epochal conflict that shaped France and England for generations, and ultimately ushered in the birth of both nations as we know them today. But why does this war still exert such a great fascination today? On the one hand, there are the dramatic stories that have come down to us, of brave knights who risk everything despite being inferior, of kings who put the fate of entire countries at stake, of ordinary soldiers whose courage and suffering were recorded in chronicles, and of course by extraordinary personalities such as Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orléans, who inspired an entire people with visions and unwavering faith. On the other hand, it is the force of the events themselves. The 100 Years' War was not simply a succession of battles, but a turning point. He heralded the end of classical chivalry. He made the English longbow a feared weapon. It weakened the feudal order and strengthened the central power of the kings. He contributed to the emergence of a national consciousness in France and England. At the same time, we must not forget the human side. Millions of people suffered from looting, famine, and the Black Death that struck Europe during the war. Entire villages disappeared, fields became deserted, cities were burned down. For ordinary people, the war was not heroic, but an endless succession of suffering and uncertainty. And yet, it is precisely this mixture of splendor and misery, of heroism and tragedy, that makes the 100 Years' War so exciting. It is a story of rise and fall, of hope and despair, of visions and betrayal. In the following chapters, we will embark on a journey through this eventful epic. We will understand the causes of the conflict, relive the great battles, shed light on the political intrigues, and trace the fates of the people who were caught between it all. It is the story of a war that was much more than just a struggle between two empires. It is the story of the birth of Europe in its present form. Chapter 2. Europe in the 14th Century. The Stage of War. To understand the 100 Years' War, we must first look at the world in which it began. Europe in the 14th century was a continent full of contrasts. On the one hand, life flourished in the cities. Merchants did business over long distances. Universities such as those in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna developed into centers of knowledge, and cathedrals shot into the sky in Gothic splendor. On the other hand, Europe was a patchwork of principalities, counties, and kingdoms where constant rivalries and wars dominated everyday life. At the beginning of the 14th century, France was the most populous and richest kingdom in Western Europe. It was a land full of fertile fields, powerful cities, and influential noble families. But France was not uniform, but a mosaic of different regions, some of which were only loosely subordinate to the king in Paris. The French king was the most powerful ruler in Europe, but his authority was not equally strong everywhere. Especially in the south and west, many nobles had great independence, which limited the crown's room for maneuver. England, on the other hand, was smaller, but no less ambitious. The island kingdom was closely linked to France through the conquests of the Normans in the 11th century. Since William the Conqueror, the English crown ruled over large areas of France. These ties had loosened over the centuries, but the English king remained a vassal of the French king for certain territories, such as the Duchy of Guyenne in the southwest. This led to a paradoxical situation. The English king was at the same time a powerful monarch and a vassal of the French king, a tension that sooner or later had to lead to conflict. In addition, there were the economic interests that bound France and England together, and at the same time had divided them. Especially the counties in Flanders, in today's Belgium, played a key role. Wealthy cities such as Bruges, Ghent, or Ypres lived there, which were dependent on the cloth trade. Their looms needed English wool, and so their prosperity depended directly on trade with England. But politically, they were dependent on the French king, which led to a constant conflict between economic necessity and political loyalty. But Europe was not only shaped by these two kingdoms. In the East, the German princes grew stronger within the framework of the Holy Roman Empire, which, however, was fragmented and had no central power. In the South, Italy shone with cities such as Florence, Venice, and Milan dominating trade and culture, while Spain was still fighting against the last Muslim rulers. The power of the church hovered over everything, claiming not only spiritual but also political authority. But it was precisely in the 14th century that the church also fell into a deep crisis, when the popes moved to Avignon and plunged Christianity into internal conflicts. All these factors made 14th century Europe a powder keg, a world that was characterized by new beginnings, trade and culture on the one hand, but was threatened by hunger, disease, and violence on the other. The beginning of the 100 Years' War did not fall in a peaceful time, but in an era that was already full of tensions. When Edward III of England finally laid claim to the French crown, he lit a fire that would burn for over a century and change the shape of Europe forever. Chapter 3. Dynastic Claims, the Dispute over the French Crown. At the beginning of the 100 Years' War, there was not a single exchange of blows, but a complicated web of succession, family ties, and wounded pride. France had been ruled for centuries by the Capetian dynasty, whose kings had always placed a direct male heir on the throne. But in 1328, everything changed. King Charles IV, the last direct male Capetian, died childless. With him, the main line was extinguished, and suddenly the question arose, who had the right to govern France? The French crown was not an ordinary possession, but a symbol of order and continuity. It could not simply be distributed at will. After the death of Charles IV, several nobles claimed the throne, but the focus was on two names: Philip of Valois, a cousin of the late king, and Edward III of England, who was a grandson of the French king Philip IV through his mother Isabella, a sister of Charles IV. From a purely genealogical point of view, Edward had a claim that was not easy to dismiss. But the French nobles chose Philip of Valois, who ascended the throne as Philip VI. Their justification was an appeal to the so-called Salian law, an old Frankish rule according to which women could not inherit the crown and could not pass on their claims to their sons. This principle became the basis of the French argument. Since Edward's claim was only through his mother, it was invalid. For the French elite, this was more than a legal subtlety. They wanted to prevent a foreign king, especially the ruler of England, from receiving the French crown and thus turning the empire into an appendage of English politics. Edward III initially reluctantly accepted this decision. He swore allegiance to Philip VI as feudal lord for his French possessions, including the Duchy of Guyenne. But the sting was deep. Edward saw himself as the rightful heir to the French crown, and the idea was also widespread in England that the king was entitled to an unlawfully denied inheritance. The seeds for the great conflict were planted. In addition, there were the practical problems that this situation brought with it. As Duke of Guyenne, Edward was officially a vassal of the French king, had to pay homage to him and pay taxes. But Edward was not just any vassal, but a powerful monarch himself. For him, it was a humiliation to serve another king. For Philip VI, on the other hand, it was a temptation to exploit England's dependence and gradually weaken the English possessions in France. Tensions grew further when Philip VI put pressure on English merchants and cities and demonstrated his power in Flanders, the most economically sensitive area. There, the cities were torn between their economic dependence on English wool and their political ties to the French king. Many Flemish uprisings were supported by England, and it soon became clear that it was no longer just a question of succession, but of domination over trade, territory, and reputation. When Philip VI finally threatened to confiscate Edward's French possessions, the measure was full. Edward reflected on his claim to the crown of France and declared that he was the true king. This began an open enmity that turned a dynastic dispute into a war of the century. What began as a legal question about Salian law turned into an epic struggle between two monarchies, both of which tied their honor, wealth, and fate to it. Chapter 4. Economic Interests, Trade, Wool, and the Role of Flanders. If you look at the 100 Years' War only as a fight for a crown, that falls short. Behind the dynastic claims was a reality that determined the daily lives of millions of people: trade. The trade in wool in particular was a decisive driver of the conflict. In the 14th century, England was one of the most important suppliers of wool in all of Europe. The sheep in the vast pastures of England produced a wool that was unsurpassed in its quality. But this wool alone was not a finished product. It had to be processed, and for this you needed the craftsmen and looms on the mainland, especially in Flanders. The Flemish cities such as Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres were vibrant centers of the cloth trade. Thousands of weavers and dyers worked here, whose prosperity depended directly on the continuous supply of English wool to Flanders. Politically, however, Flanders belonged to the French sphere of influence, and the Counts of Flanders were in a delicate relationship of dependence with Paris. This led to a constant tension between economic necessity and political loyalty. When France and England quarreled, Flanders was at the center, and the citizens of these rich cities had to decide whether to follow their king or their bread. Philip VI of France was aware of the importance of Flanders and tried to expand his influence there. He wanted to bind the trading cities more closely to himself and at the same time weaken England by blocking the wool trade. For the Flemish weavers and merchants, however, this was a disaster. Without English wool, their industry threatened to come to a standstill, and hunger and riots were the result. More than once, the citizens of Ghent or Bruges rose up against their own count and sought proximity to England, because that was where their economic lifeline lay. Edward III skillfully knew how to use this discontent for his own purposes. He not only offered Flemish cities access to English wool, but also presented himself as the protector of their freedom against the French crown. This resulted in alliances that went far beyond mere trade relations. England gained political allies in the middle of the French sphere of influence, and Flanders became a scene where the main lines of the war became visible. But it wasn't just about wool. The entire maritime trade played a decisive role. England needed free trade routes across the English Channel to export her goods, while France tried to block these routes and weaken the English fleet. Whoever ruled the sea could not only determine trade, but also move troops, supplies, and weapons. Thus, the economic conflict immediately became a military question. The close links between politics and business meant that war was not only in the hands of kings and knights, but influenced the lives of entire societies. Farmers in England had to keep sheep to supply the wool. Traders in Flanders waited for ships whose cargo decided whether they were wealthy or poor. Merchants in Italy and the Holy Roman Empire followed with interest how the balance of power developed, because they too benefited or suffered depending on the outcome of the conflicts. In this sense, the 100 Years' War was not only a dispute over a crown, but a struggle for economic networks that supplied the heart of Europe. The close intertwining of trade and war made the conflict even more bitter, because when the livelihoods of entire cities and regions were at stake, no compromise could secure lasting peace. Every armistice was fragile, because economic interests immediately flared up again. It is therefore no coincidence that many of England's early campaigns relied on Flemish support, and France did everything in its power to prevent this connection. So the war, which officially began in 1337, was also a dispute over who would exercise control over Europe's wealth, the Crown of France or the Crown of England. Chapter 5. The beginning of 1337. Edward III lays claim. The year 1337 marks the official beginning of the 100 Years' War. The conflict had been looming for a long time, and tensions between England and France had continued to grow in the years before. But now came the moment when words and threats were no longer enough, and diplomatic wrangling turned into open hostility. Philip VI of France had understood how to systematically expand his influence. He put the English king under increasing pressure in his French possessions. The Duchy of Guyenne, a fertile area in southwestern France, was a constant bone of contention. Officially, it belonged to the French kingdom, but for generations the English kings had ruled there as dukes. Edward III therefore actually had to act as a vassal of the French king, although he himself was a powerful monarch. This contradictory relationship has been a constant breeding ground for conflict. In the spring of 1337, Philip VI accused the English king of not fulfilling his feudal duties and declared that Guyenne had now withdrawn from the crown of France. For Edward, this was not just a political blow, but an open humiliation. He saw that France was not only threatening his possessions, but ultimately his position of power throughout Europe. This contradictory relationship has been a constant breeding ground for conflict. In the spring of 1337, Philip VI accused the English king of not fulfilling his feudal duties and declared that Guyenne had now withdrawn from the crown of France. For Edward, this was not just a political blow, but an open humiliation. He saw that France was not only threatening his possessions, but ultimately his position of power throughout Europe. This decision was made. Edward dropped the mask and laid claim to the crown of France. His claim was not new, but now he made it the core of his policy. Through his mother Isabella, he was the grandson of the French king Philip IV, and from this line he derived his right. If he was denied the French crown on the basis of Salian law, he considered this argument to be nothing more than an excuse to exclude him. With the open proclamation of his claim, Edward set a beacon. He, the King of England, was the true ruler of France. The conflict that arose was not a pure duel between two kings. It was a struggle that encompassed half of Europe. Edward sought allies, especially in the Netherlands and the Holy Roman Empire. Many princes were only too willing to take part in a war against France if English gold and English trade connections were tempting. Philip VI, on the other hand, was able to rely on the power of the French crown, the loyalty of many nobles, and the support of large parts of the church. In the summer of 1337, open war began. Initially, it was minor skirmishes and attacks on cities that shaped the conflict. But it soon became clear that this was not a limited dispute over individual territories, but a long, bloody war that would open up new fronts over and over again. England waged its first campaigns in Flanders and Brittany, where it found supporters. France responded with retaliatory strikes, mainly directed against the English possessions in Guyenne. No one was aware that this war would last for generations, but the foundations were laid. On the one side was Edward III, who had elevated the conflict to a new dimension with his claim to the French crown. On the other side was Philip VI, who was determined to defend the empire from the grasp of a foreign ruler. Between them lay not only a dispute over inheritance rights, but also the question of who should hold supremacy in Europe. This dispute gave rise to a war that was to change the face of the continent. Chapter 6. The Battle of Sluys, 1340. England conquers the seas. The first years of the war were marked by smaller campaigns and the struggle for alliances, but soon an event occurred that was to have a decisive influence on the course of the conflict. It was not a battle on land where knights and archers clashed, but a huge clash at sea. The Battle of Sluys in 1340 marked the moment when England gained control of the English Channel, laying the foundation for many of her later successes. Edward III knew that his position in the war could only be maintained if he could bring his troops and supplies safely across the sea. France, on the other hand, recognized the importance of the sea routes and built up a powerful fleet, which was stationed in the port of Sluis, near today's Belgian coast. In the early summer of 1340, more than 200 ships gathered there, including armed merchant ships and war barges manned by sailors and soldiers. France hoped not only to cut off England from Flanders with this fleet, but also to be able to threaten the English coast itself. Edward decided to take up the challenge. With around 150 ships, he sailed from the Thames toward Sluis. His fleet was smaller, but he relied on tactics and the courage of his men. Unlike the French, who chained their ships together to form a solid line, Edward relied on agility and aggressiveness. When the English fleet met the French on June 24, 1340, a thunder of war horns and trumpets arose, and the waters of the English Channel turned into a battlefield. The French had hoped to force the English into a rigid front, but the English ships used their maneuverability to attack individual enemy ships again and again. Archers stood on deck and sent volleys of arrows across the water, while boarding squads jumped from ship to ship and fought in close combat. The battle raged for hours, and the canal turned red with the blood of the fallen. In the end, the French disaster was complete. Much of their fleet was destroyed or captured, and thousands of sailors and soldiers died. Only a few ships escaped. Edward III had won an overwhelming victory. England now controlled the sea routes and was able to bring her troops to the continent almost unhindered. France, on the other hand, had lost its maritime strength for years. The significance of this victory could hardly be overestimated. Without its supremacy at sea, it would hardly have been possible for England to penetrate deep into the French mainland. With the securing of the sea routes, Edward was now able to plan larger campaigns that were to shake France badly in the years to come. At the same time, he gained prestige in the eyes of his allies. The Flemish cities, whose prosperity depended on free trade, saw Edward as a powerful protector. But the victory at Sluis was not only a military triumph, but also a symbol. He showed that the war would not be decided on French soil alone, but also on the seas that separated the two empires. For the English, the battle became an early myth, a testament to their naval power, which would be part of their identity for centuries to come. With Sluis, Edward had laid the foundation to take the next big steps. He had secured the English Channel, consolidated his position in Flanders, and showed France that the English claim was more than just words. Now the war could enter its first major phase, in which the legendary battles of Crécy and Poitiers were to shake history.
Chapter 7. Crécy, 1346. The Rise of the Longbow. 6 years after Sluis' victory, England was to achieve another triumph, this time on land, and it became a symbol of the military turn of the Middle Ages. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 is still considered one of the most famous moments of the Hundred Years' War, not only because of the English success, but also because of the revolutionary role played by a seemingly simple weapon, the longbow. After a few years of relative calm, Edward III had once again begun a major campaign. With a strong army, he landed in Normandy, plundered cities, devastated villages, and drew a swath of destruction through northern France. His goal was to force the French king Philip VI into open battle. France then mobilized a huge army consisting of knights, mercenaries, and the dreaded Genoese crossbowmen. Both armies met on 26 August 1346 near the small town of Crécy. The French army was numerically superior. Contemporary chroniclers speak of more than 40,000 men, while the English may have 15,000 soldiers. Philip VI trusted in the power of his knights and the strength of the crossbowmen, who had been considered one of the most effective long-range weapons for decades. Edward, however, relied on a different strategy. He had his army positioned in a defensive position, on a hill, protected by trenches and obstacles. On the flanks and in the center, he positioned his longbowmen, men from Wales and England, trained with their massive bows to shoot arrows over hundreds of meters with deadly precision. When the French attacked, a spectacle began that determined the course of the battle. The Genoese crossbowmen stepped forward, but they were exhausted from a long march and did not have their shields with them. In addition, rain weighed on their tendons, causing the crossbows to lose reach. The English longbowmen used this advantage mercilessly. They fired volleys of arrows that rained down on the French like a black rain. Whole ranks collapsed, and panic seized the crossbowmen. Philip VI, enraged by the hesitation of his troops, ordered his knights to ride down their own mercenaries and to attack themselves. But they also got into the deadly zone of the English arrows. Horses collapsed, knights fell to the ground heavily armored and were crushed in the mud. Again and again the French waves tried to break through the English lines, but each time the hailfire of the longbows shattered them. The battle turned into a bloodbath in which French superiority counted for nothing. One tragic moment of this battle became particularly famous: the death of the Bohemian king John, the blind king. Although he could hardly see anymore, he let his knights lead him into battle, tied up for the sake of his honor. Together, they stormed into the English hail of arrows and met their deaths. This scene went down in the chronicles, a symbol of chivalry that was shattered by the harsh reality of modern warfare. At the end of the day, the French defeat was devastating. Thousands of knights and soldiers lay on the field, while the English suffered only minor losses. Crécy impressively showed that the age of the heavily armored knights in the open campaign was coming to an end. Disciplined foot soldiers, and especially the English longbow, had humiliated the nobility of France. Crécy's victory opened the way north for the English. A few months later, they besieged Calais, a city that would serve as an important bridgehead for decades. But already in Crécy, it became clear that this war was not only a battle of kings, but an upheaval of warfare itself. The longbow, operated by simple peasants and commoners, had shaken the rule of the knights and thus heralded a new era.
Chapter 8. The Siege of Calais in 1347, a symbolic victory. After the triumphant victory at Crécy in 1346, Edward III of England was faced with a crucial question. How could he consolidate the success and anchor it permanently in French soil? He found the answer in the strategically located port city of Calais. This city, located directly on the English Channel, was a gateway to Flanders and, at the same time, a key to the connection between England and the European mainland. Whoever controlled Calais controlled trade, supply routes, and access to northern France. In September 1346, Edward began the siege, which was to become one of the most famous episodes of the entire war. Calais was well fortified, surrounded by walls, towers, and moats. In addition, it was located in a swampy area, which made attacks more difficult. But Edward was determined not to take the city by storm, but to starve it out. He built a fortified camp that almost resembled a city, with wooden houses, chapels, and markets. His army settled in as if it would live there permanently. The months passed, and the citizens of Calais suffered more and more from the blockade. Food became scarce, diseases broke out, and morale plummeted. France tried to relieve the city, but after the defeat at Crécy, the army was weakened and could not achieve a resounding success. Philip VI dared to try to break the siege, but the English lines held out and the French retreated. Finally, after almost a year, the situation in Calais was hopeless. The inhabitants were close to starvation, and the city had to capitulate. But Edward was merciless. He demanded that 6 of the most distinguished citizens of Calais, barefoot and dressed only in shirts, should surrender to him with ropes around their necks, ready to sacrifice their lives for the city. This scene, described in detail by chroniclers such as Jean Froissart, shaped the image of the siege for posterity. The 6 citizens stepped before Edward, ready to suffer death. But here something unexpected happened. Queen Philippa of Hainaut, Edward's wife, was also in the camp and implored her husband to spare the men. She appealed to his heart and to the honor due to a victorious king. Edward relented. The citizens were pardoned, and so this cruel episode received a humane end, which was immortalized in legends and works of art. With the capture of Calais in August 1347, however, England had gained much more than just a city. Calais became an English bridgehead that would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries. From here, they could invade France at any time, trade, and demonstrate their power. For France, on the other hand, the loss was a deep blow to the heart. Calais was not just a port, but a symbol of the fact that the English king had gained a firm foothold in their country. The siege of Calais showed that the war was decided not only by quick battles, but also by patience, perseverance, and the ability to use resources in the long term. For Edward, this was a triumph that cemented his fame as a warlord. For the people of Calais, it was a tragedy that forced them into the spell of England. But for historiography, it became one of the most impressive episodes of the 100 Years' War, an example of how power and humanity, cruelty and mercy met in a single scene.
Chapter 9. The Black Death and its Impact on War. No sooner had England and France fought their first major battles than an even more devastating power swept across Europe, a power that made no distinction between kings and peasants and cruelly shaped the history of the 100 Years' War, the Black Death. The plague reached Europe in 1347, the same year that Calais fell into the hands of the English. From the ports of Italy, it spread rapidly across the continent, leaving behind a trail of death such as the world had hardly known before. The plague was unstoppable. Traders, pilgrims, and soldiers carried the plague from city to city. Entire villages died out within a few weeks, cities sank into chaos, and fields remained uncultivated because there was no one left to work them. The chroniclers of the time report streets lined with corpses, carts full of dead thrown into mass graves, and an ever-present smell of death and decay. It was a disaster of unimaginable proportions. It is estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the European population lost their lives. The plague also raged with full force in England and France. Entire armies disintegrated because the disease swept through the camps. Sieges had to be broken off, not because the defenders held out, but because attackers and defenders alike were swept away. For the kings, it was as if God himself had interrupted the war. Edward III and Philip VI had to realize that although they could send armies into battle, they were powerless against an invisible threat. The social and economic consequences of the epidemic were as enormous as its immediate horrors. With the death of so many farmers and craftsmen, wages rose rapidly because labor became scarce. At the same time, trade collapsed in many places, markets became orphaned, and famines followed. Entire regions were depopulated, and the old structures of feudal society began to falter. Farmers who had survived recognized their new value and began to protest more confidently against the burdens of taxes and services. For the war, the plague meant an unwanted break. The major campaigns were conducted less intensively for years because both sides had neither the men nor the means to carry out decisive operations. But the plague not only changed the rhythm of the war, it also changed the mentality of the people. Faith in the order of the world, in the power of the church, and the security of society was deeply shaken. Many saw the plague as God's punishment and sought comfort in piety and penance. Others lost all hope and surrendered to a life of despair. The Black Death thus became an invisible player in the 100 Years' War. It depopulated the landscapes, weakened the armies, and brought unrest to the societies. And although the plague subsided after a few years, it always returned in waves. Their shadows accompanied the war until its end. The kings could win victories and conquer cities, but they were helpless against this invisible power. The plague showed how small people's plans could seem when nature itself played its cruel game. Chapter 10. The Treaty of Bretigny, 1360. An Apparent Peace. After years of battle, Marked by spectacular battles such as Crécy and the conquest of Calais, the scales finally seemed to tip in England's favor. Edward III had severely damaged France, and the plague had also depleted the country. In the 1350s, further catastrophes were added. France experienced not only military defeats, but also internal unrest, uprisings, and a deep financial crisis. In this situation, the next decisive stage of the Hundred Years' War took place, which culminated in the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360. The immediate backdrop was the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, in which the English, led by Edward's son, the Black Prince Edward of Woodstock, had won an overwhelming victory. There, the French king John II had been taken prisoner, an event that hit France to the core. The king in English hands was not only a political disaster, but also a humiliation that shook confidence in the crown. While John II was imprisoned in London, France plunged into a phase of chaos. Without a strong king, order collapsed. Nobles fought for influence. The people rose up in furious uprisings such as the Jacquerie, and battles raged in Paris between different factions. England cleverly exploited this weakness. Again and again, English troops devastated large parts of France in so-called chevauchées, rapid raids that were aimed less at conquest than at destruction and intimidation. Villages went up in flames, fields were trampled down, and people fled in panic. In this situation, France had to negotiate. In 1360, envoys from both sides met in the town of Bretigny near Chartres to negotiate peace. The resulting treaty was an apparent triumph for England. Edward III renounced his claim to the French crown, but in return he received huge territories as direct sovereign possessions. In particular, the Duchy of Aquitaine, which comprised almost a third of France, passed into English hands, this time no longer as a fief, but as unrestricted property. Other regions, such as Calais, also remained with England. For France, this treaty was a bitter blow. Although King John II returned from captivity, the price was high. France's territorial integrity was massively weakened, and the crown had to pay huge ransoms to free the king. Many French people saw peace as a disgrace, and it should never be seen as permanent. On the English side, too, the treaty was not as stable as it seemed. Although Edward had made big profits, the renunciation of the French royal title was difficult for many of his supporters to accept. In addition, it was difficult to secure the new territories permanently. France was weakened, but by no means broken. The crown worked tirelessly to restore its authority, and many French nobles were determined to reconquer the lost territories. Thus, the Treaty of Bretigny was a peace on paper, but in reality it was only a respite. Both empires were exhausted by war, plague, and internal tensions, and both needed time to regain their strength. But it soon became clear that the conflict was far from over. The 100 Years' War had experienced its first major phase, but it was far from over. The Treaty of Bretigny was not an end, but merely an intermediate act in a drama that was to last almost a century.
Chapter 11. Charles V of France and Bertrand du Guesclin, the Reconquest. No sooner had the Treaty of Bretigny been signed than reality began to undermine it. France had lost large territories, but the memory of the humiliation was still fresh, and there was little willingness to accept this defeat. It was only a matter of time before the forces were reorganized. With the death of King John II in 1364, a new phase began. His son, Charles V, called the Wise, ascended the throne and proved to be a ruler of rare wisdom and strategic skill. Under his leadership, and with the help of the Breton general Bertrand du Guesclin, France was to take the path to reconquest. Charles V was very different from his predecessors. He was not a king who sought glory in battle or distinguished himself with spectacular heroic deeds. Rather, he was a strategist, a thinker, someone who understood that England could not be defeated by open battles.
The defeats at Crécy and Poitiers had taught France that the English army with its longbowmen was almost invincible in a classical battle. Charles V therefore relied on a different tactic: patience, perseverance, and attrition of the opponent. At his side was Bertrand du Guesclin, one of the most important commanders of the Middle Ages. He was not a brilliant knight of noble birth, but a man from Brittany who had worked his way up through courage, tenacity, and unshakable loyalty. Du Guesclin was the opposite of the idealized knight: small, stocky, not of great beauty, but full of determination. Under his leadership, the French army learned how to hold its own against the English. Instead of open battles, he waged guerrilla warfare, raided supply routes, besieged smaller castles, and gradually deprived the English of control of the country. Charles V supported this strategy by reorganizing the administration and finances of France. He relied on clever tax policy, strengthened royal authority, and used every opportunity to play off England's weaknesses. England was weakened by internal conflicts and financial problems at that time. The constant campaigns cost vast sums of money, and the population began to question the war. While Edward III was getting old and sick, and his son, the Black Prince, was suffering from illness, France was slowly growing together again. Step by step, the French regained lost territories. Cities under English control changed sides, castles fell after sieges, and entire regions slipped away from English influence. Bertrand du Guesclin proved to be a master of perseverance. He avoided major battles in which England could play out its superiority, and instead relied on pinpricks, which had far more effect in the long run. By the time of his death in 1380, Charles V had managed to decisively change the image of France. An empire that lay on the ground after the defeats of Crécy and Poitiers had once again become a united power that stood up to the English. Bertrand du Guesclin, who had been appointed Constable of France, the commander-in-chief of the army, shortly before his death, became a national hero. His name stood for bravery, perseverance, and the indomitable will to liberate the fatherland. The reconquests under Charles V and du Guesclin showed that the Hundred Years' War was by no means an English triumph. France had learned the right lessons from the mistakes of the past. With strategy, patience, and the courage of extraordinary men, it was possible to wrest their successes from the English. However, this did not end the war. It only entered a new phase, in which internal conflicts and power struggles were to play as important a role as the battles themselves.
Chapter 12. Crises and Civil Wars, Armagnacs versus Bourguignons. No sooner had France regained strength under Charles V, the empire fell into a new period of uncertainty after his death in 1380. His successor, Charles VI, ascended the throne as a child, and the first years of his reign were marked by regents and intrigues at court. At first, the empire seemed stable despite these circumstances, but soon a weakness was revealed that was almost to destroy France in the coming decades: internal divisions. While England itself staggered into crises, France disintegrated into bitter camps that fought against each other and tore the country apart from within. Charles VI, who would later go down in history as the Madman, suffered from severe mental breakdowns since his youth. At times, he was incapable of governing, and it was at these moments that the great noble families took power. Two groups in particular gained influence: the Armagnacs and the Bourguignons. Behind these names were not simple parties, but complex alliances of powerful nobles, cities, and interest groups, each of which struggled for control of the king and thus of France. The Bourguignons were under the leadership of the House of Burgundy, one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. They ruled over a vast territory that stretched from what is now Belgium deep into eastern France and had enormous wealth through trade and cities such as Dijon or Ghent. Their policies were pragmatic and often shaped by self-interest, which made them changeable allies. The Armagnacs, on the other hand, relied on the House of Armagnac in the south of France and allied themselves with the heirs to the throne, who tried to maintain royal authority.
They saw themselves as the true defenders of the French crown, while the Burgundians were increasingly seen as traitors who put their own advantages above the good of the empire. The conflict between these two camps repeatedly degenerated into open violence. Paris, the heart of France, was shaken several times by street battles. Civil wars raged in which the French fought against the French, while England watched from the outside, waiting for its opportunity. For the English crown, this inner turmoil of France was a gift. She just had to find the right moment to strike again. It became particularly disastrous when the Burgundians began to establish contacts with England. For tactical reasons, they sometimes sided with the enemy in order to weaken their rivals, the Armagnacs. This division completely paralyzed France. Even in moments of greatest danger, when English armies were in the country, the French nobles were more concerned with defending their own interests than with resisting together. Thus, in the years after the death of Charles V, France became an empire that was more internally divided than ever before. The madness of the king, the rivalry between Armagnacs and Burgundians, and the weakness of the crown opened the door to England. The 100 Years' War thus shifted into a new phase, in which no longer only two kingdoms stood against each other, but in which France itself threatened to break apart. It was a civil war within a war, and it prepared the ground for the next great catastrophe that was to befall the empire in the form of Henry V of England.
Chapter 13. England in Transition, Richard II and the Weakness of the Empire. While France was torn apart by internal divisions between Armagnacs and Bourguignons, England was not free of crises either. After the great successes of Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, the island kingdom fell into a phase of uncertainty at the end of the 14th century. The Black Prince had already died in 1376, before his father. And so Edward III was succeeded not by the shining hero of Poitiers, but by his young grandson, Richard II, who ascended the throne as a child. Richard II was only 10 years old when he became king in 1377. At a time when strong leadership was needed, a child suddenly stood at the head of the empire. The government was therefore in the hands of rulers and advisors, who were often more interested in their own advantages than in the welfare of the empire. Nevertheless, Richard would have to prove early on that he could take responsibility, because the people rose up in one of the greatest uprisings in English history, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The cause lay in the high taxes that the war against France had devoured. The common people were exhausted by the taxes and the burdens that were imposed on them. Under the leadership of men like Wat Tyler, the insurgents marched into London, stormed buildings, burned down archives, and demanded radical change. Richard II, barely older than 14, confronted them and spoke personally with the rebels. With courage and skill, he succeeded in calming the crowd. But when the uprising was crushed, it was already clear how deep the tensions in England went. Richard II was not a weak king in the classical sense, but he possessed qualities that made him unpopular with the nobility and the people alike. He was prone to arrogance, favored a narrow circle of minions, and often ignored the needs of the broader nobility. In particular, the Parliament, which was becoming increasingly important in England, felt ignored by him. Conflicts between the crown and the nobility increased, and eventually there was open hostility. Meanwhile, the war policy also came to a standstill. England could not continue the successes of the past. The campaigns became more expensive, revenues were no longer sufficient, and domestic political tensions prevented consistent leadership. France, which was gathering its forces under Charles V and later under the Armagnacs, gradually regained lost ground, while England fell into lethargy. The climax of Richard's problems came in 1399. His cousin Henry of Lancaster, later Henry IV, laid claim to the throne. Richard was deposed, captured, and finally murdered in prison under mysterious circumstances. This brought an abrupt end to his rule, and England entered a new phase of uncertainty. With the change of power to Henry IV, the Lancaster dynasty began, but the internal weakness remained. England was shaken by disputes over the throne, economic hardship, and a society that was increasingly questioning the endless wars. While France suffered in the civil war between Armagnacs and Bourguignons, England was also far from being a united, strong opponent. But it was precisely from this apparent weakness that a king was soon to emerge, who waged the war with new determination. Henry V, one of England's most famous rulers, who was to go down in history with his victory at Agincourt.
Chapter 14. The Rise of Henry V, a King for War. With the end of the reign of Richard II and the rise of the Lancaster dynasty, England initially seemed to plunge into a phase of uncertainty. Henry IV, the first king of this new line, was energetic, but his reign was marked by uprisings, conspiracies, and a constant struggle for legitimacy. His claim to the crown was not unchallenged, and he had to devote a lot of energy to holding down internal opponents. The war against France took a back seat during this period, and England was more concerned with stabilizing herself. When Henry IV died in 1413, his son ascended the throne, Henry V, a young man of just 26 years of age, whose name was soon to shine in the annals of Europe. Henry had already gained experience in his father's wars as a prince, and had earned a reputation as a capable military leader. But what really set him apart was his determination. He not only wanted to continue the 100 Years' War, but also to lead England to rule over France once and for all. Henry V was a king who seemed to be made for war. Strict, disciplined, and characterized by deep piety, he combined religious conviction with political ambition. He saw himself as sent by God to enforce the English claim to the French crown. Unlike many of his predecessors, he left no doubt about his determination. From the very beginning of his reign, he made it clear that he wanted to fight France not only in skirmishes, but in a campaign that amounted to a decisive battle. The situation in France played into his hands. Charles VI, the French king, was hardly able to govern due to his illness, the attacks of madness that repeatedly befell him. The country was torn between the hostile camps of the Armagnacs and Bourguignons, who fought for control of the court. France was internally divided, and Henry V saw his chance. In 1415, he set out on a great campaign. His goal was the conquest of Normandy, but at the same time, he wanted to claim the French crown for himself. Henry's claim was the same as that of his predecessor, Edward III, but he presented it with new severity and conviction. At a time when France was on the ground, he wanted to substantiate his claim with a decisive battle. Henry was not only a warrior, but also a skilled diplomat. He carefully prepared his campaign, secured support in his own country, and built up an army that relied less on heavy knights than on the proven strength of the English archers. These men, often from humble backgrounds, were the real power of England in this war. Their longbows had already humiliated the French nobility at Crécy and Poitiers, and Henry knew that they could tip the scales again. In August 1415, he sailed across the English Channel with a fleet and landed in Normandy. He first besieged the city of Harfleur, which fell after a long battle, but the siege had weakened his army. Disease and hunger had killed many men, and Henry's army was greatly reduced. Nevertheless, he decided not to give up, but to move north with his weakened but determined army to make his way home to Calais. What he didn't suspect was that the French had set up a huge force to block his way back. The legendary encounter at Agincourt was to take place, where Henry V was to secure his place in history forever.
Chapter 15. Agincourt, 1415. Myth and Reality of a Battle. The morning of October 25, 1415, was cold and damp. Fog hung over the fields near the small village of Agincourt in northern France, and the ground was soaked by the rain of the last few days. There, Henry V's army, tired, sick, and far outnumbered, faced the superior French forces. What happened on that day would become one of the most famous chapters of the 100 Years' War, an event that created legends and is still remembered today. Henry's army had been reduced to less than 10,000 men, many weakened by disease and exhausted after the march from Harfleur. The French, on the other hand, were estimated to have more than 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers at their disposal, including a huge contingent of knights and heavy cavalry. France wanted to use this day to inflict a crushing defeat on the English and to turn the war around once and for all. But Henry had an advantage. He understood how to use the strengths of his army. He had his men lined up in a tight formation, flanked by dense forests, which offered the French hardly any room for their numerical superiority. In the center stood his knights and men on foot, but on the sides was the real force, the English longbowmen. These men had driven deep stakes into the ground to stop the French cavalry and stood ready to draw their bows. When the French started to attack, the field turned into an inferno of arrows. Thousands of arrows shot into the air at the same time and rained down on the advancing knights. Horses collapsed, men fell in the mud, and the tight formation of the French became their undoing. The muddy ground made every step a torture, and soon the attackers were jammed in a chaotic crowd, unable to use their superiority. The English archers shot incessantly, and by the time the French finally reached the English lines, they were already exhausted and in disorder. In hand-to-hand combat, the English proved to be tough and disciplined. Henry himself fought at the front, a king who stood with sword and armor in the midst of his men. Later, chroniclers report that he was even hit by a blow to the helmet that almost killed him, but he survived and led his troops on. The French losses were devastating. Numerous nobles were killed, including dukes, counts, and knights from the most prestigious families. For France, it was not only a military defeat, but a tragedy of the nobility, a blow to the elite of the empire. The English, on the other hand, lost comparatively few men, which made the victory all the more spectacular. Agincourt immediately became a myth. For the English, it was proof that God was on their side, and that discipline, tactics, and courage were more important than mere numbers. The longbow, the weapon of simple men, had pushed the high nobility of France into the mud. For the French, it was a bitter trauma that showed how much the divisions and arrogance of their knights had become their undoing. But as brilliant as this victory was, it did not mean the end of the war. Despite the triumph, Henry had to realize that England did not have the strength to subjugate all of France in a single campaign. But Agincourt gave him tremendous moral authority. He returned to England like a hero, celebrated by the people, and strengthened in his conviction that the French throne was within reach. The Battle of Agincourt thus became a turning point, not only militarily, but symbolically. It embodied the triumph of the seemingly weak over the strong, of the inferior over the overpowering. And it prepared the ground for Henry's further campaign, which was to hit France even harder.
Chapter 16. The English Conquest of Normandy and the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. After the triumph of Agincourt, Henry V returned to England as a celebrated hero. But for him, the victory was not the end, but only the beginning of a larger strategy. His goal was nothing less than the complete subjugation of France and the recognition of its claim to the French crown. To do this, he not only had to win individual battles, but also permanently conquer territories that could form the foundation of his rule. In 1417, he therefore began a new campaign, this time with the clear goal of bringing Normandy into English hands. This region was not only of symbolic importance because it was once home to the Norman conquerors, but also of great strategic and economic importance. Henry landed with a well-organized army, systematically besieging one city after another and relying on a combination of military pressure and political calculation. Unlike many of his predecessors, he was not a pure destroyer, but tried to integrate the conquered territories into a functioning administration. The siege of Caen, one of the most important cities in Normandy, lasted several weeks, but eventually the city fell into English hands.
Other places either surrendered without a fight or were taken after fierce resistance. Heinrich was tough but also pragmatic. He knew that he had to win over the population to secure rule, so he had order and administration restored while demonstrating his power. In 1419, the siege of Rouen, the heart of Normandy, followed. The city held out for months, but the English blockade constricted it more and more. Hunger and disease killed thousands until the defenders finally had to capitulate. With the fall of Rouen, Normandy was practically under English control, and Henry had created a powerful base from which to threaten the rest of France. While Henry celebrated military successes, France continued to tear apart from its internal conflicts. The enmity between the Armagnacs and the Bourguignons reached a new climax when the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, was murdered in 1419 during a meeting with the Armagnacs. This assassination shook the empire and finally drove the Burgundians into the arms of England. Suddenly, Henry had a powerful French ally at his side, who had wealth, troops, and influence. This new alliance paved the way for the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, one of the most notable agreements of the entire era. In it, Henry V was recognized as the rightful heir to the French crown. King Charles VI, who was no longer able to rule himself due to his illness, agreed that Henry should marry his daughter Catherine of Valois. Henry thus became not only the son-in-law of the French king, but also the designated successor. Charles' own son, the Dauphin Karl, was effectively disinherited. For England, this was the culmination of its success in the 100 Years' War. For the first time, it seemed realistic that the English crown could permanently get France into its hands. Henry was at the height of his power, celebrated as king, military commander, and now also as the future ruler of France. But fate was to decide otherwise. Henry V died in 1422, only 2 years after the Treaty of Troyes, at the age of 35. His dream of ruling over a united Anglo-French empire came to an abrupt end. His inheritance was now in the hands of his young son, Henry VI, who received the crown as a child. This marked the beginning of a new, uncertain phase in which England controlled large parts of France but did not have the strength to secure them permanently. Chapter 17. The Appearance of Joan of Arc, Orléans, 1429. When Henry V died, England seemed to be at the height of its power. The Treaty of Troyes had legally substantiated the English's claim to the French crown. Normandy was firmly in their hands, and the Burgundians were on their side. But this triumph was fragile, because France was weakened, but not defeated. The Dauphin Charles, the disinherited son of Charles VI, held out in the south and center of the country, and many French were not prepared to surrender their kingdom to England without a fight. In this time of despair and hopelessness, a figure appeared on stage who seemed to have sprung from a legend, Joan of Arc. Jeanne, a simple peasant girl from Domremy and Lorraine, was 16 or 17 years old when she began to tell of visions. She said that saints and angels spoke to her and had given her the task of saving France and leading the Dauphin to Reims so that he could be crowned king there. In an era in which faith and religion determined daily life, her words did not seem like those of a dreamer, but like a divine message. At first, she was met with skepticism. What could a young girl from a village do when kings and generals had failed? But Jeanne was not only carried by an unshakable faith, she also had a charismatic charisma that captivated men and women alike. She convinced the Dauphin to listen to her, and eventually received a small force with which she was sent to the front, to the besieged city of Orléans. Orléans was crucial. The city on the lower bend had been surrounded by English troops for months. Their fall would have opened the door to the south of France for the English and made the Dauphin's position almost hopeless. But in the spring of 1429, Joan of Arc appeared in the city, dressed in armor, with a flag in her hand decorated with religious symbols. The effect was electrifying. The demoralized population and the exhausted soldiers drew new hope. Jeanne preached courage, faith, and the firm will that God himself fought at her side. Under their leadership, the defenders dared to make mistakes, attacked the English positions, and achieved surprising successes. Within a few days, the tide turned. The English, who had hitherto seemed unshakable, panicked and withdrew. Orléans was liberated. The news spread like wildfire. All of France spoke of the miracle of Orléans and of the Virgin who had saved the country. Joan of Arc became the symbol of a new hope, and it was through her that the Dauphin Charles gained the courage to finally take the step he had long shied away from, the road to Reims, where the kings of France were traditionally crowned. Joan's appearance fundamentally changed the war. Until then, England seemed unstoppable, but now France rose from despair. Joan embodied the belief that the struggle was not only political or military, but a sacred mission. Her courage, her voice, and her determination gave the French resistance a new strength that no army in the world could easily break.
Chapter 18. The Coronation of Charles VII and the Trial of Joan of Arc. The victory of Orléans had awakened France as if from a deep sleep. Joan of Arc, the simple girl from Domremy, had now become the central figure of the war. But she was more than just a military leader. It was the symbol of a divine mandate, the living embodiment of the hope that France was not lost. Her influence on the Dauphin Karl was enormous. A hesitant, insecure prince became a man who finally had the courage to redeem his claim to the throne. In the summer of 1429, Jean led the army on its way to Reims. This march was more than a military undertaking. It was a religious pilgrimage, a symbol of the rebirth of France. Cities that had previously hesitated to profess their allegiance to Charles now opened their doors, overwhelmed by the enthusiasm that Jean ignited. It was as if God himself had laid his hand over France and called people to unite. On July 17, 1429, the train reached its destination. In the Cathedral of Reims, the Dauphin was solemnly crowned king. Charles VII now stood before his people as the anointed king of France, and Joan of Arc, in armor and with her flag, stood by his side. This moment was of inestimable importance. The Treaty of Troyes had actually expropriated him, but the coronation in Reims restored divine legitimacy. For France, this was the decisive step. They once again had a rightful king whom they could unite. But Jean's star was not to shine forever. After the coronation, Charles urged her to further campaigns in order to drive the English out of France once and for all. But Karl hesitated, caught up in political considerations and diplomatic games. Jean, trusting in divine inspiration, wanted to act decisively, while the king and his advisors acted cautiously. This opposition weakened their position. In the spring of 1430, Jean went into battle again, this time against the Burgundians, who were still allied with England. During the defense of Compiègne, she was captured in a battle. Their enemies knew at once what invaluable booty they had made. Jean was not only a military leader, she was the heart and soul of the French resistance. The Burgundians handed them over to the English, and soon after, one of the most notorious trials of the Middle Ages began. In Rouen, Jean was brought before an ecclesiastical court, accused of heresy, sorcery, and disobedience to the Church. In truth, the trial was politically motivated. England not only wanted to condemn a young woman, but to destroy the symbol that had given France so much power. The trial was a show trial. Attempts were made to convict Jean by trick questions and threats, to force her to confess, and to present her visions as diabolical deceptions. But Jean remained steadfast. She answered with a clarity and dignity that impressed even her judges. She insisted that her voices came from God and that she had remained true to her mission. On 30 May 1431, the sentence was carried out. Joan of Arc was burned in the market square of Rouen. At just 19 years old, she died the cruelest death that could be inflicted on her. For the English, it was a triumph, but for France, she became a martyr. Her death made her immortal.
A simple peasant girl became a saint of the people, a symbol stronger than any army. The coronation of Charles VII and the death of Joan of Arc marked a turning point in the war. France had a king again, and even though Jean had fallen, her spirit lived on. It had shown that France was not invincible under England's yoke. Their sacrifice lit a flame that wouldn't go out until the war ended. Chapter 19. The Turning Point. France grows stronger. England breaks up. After Joan of Arc's death, it seemed for a moment as if the English had won their greatest victory. Not only had they captured and executed the charismatic leader, but they had also tried to smear their legacy. But the plan did not work out. Jean's death was not seen as a defeat in France, but as a victim. She became a martyr, and her name echoed through towns and villages, a constant call to continue the struggle. In truth, the real turnaround only began now. Charles VII, who had long hesitated and doubted, gained new certainty after the coronation in Reims and the courage that Joan had inspired in him. He began to rebuild his kingdom step by step. First, he reorganized the administration, strengthened the finances, and created a standing army that was no longer solely dependent on the whims of the nobles. This was a revolution. France relied on a royal army that served the king faithfully and not the interests of individual princes. With this, Charles regained control of the war. At the same time, England weakened itself. The death of Henry V had put the empire in a difficult position, because his successor, Henry VI, was still a child, unable to rule himself. The regency was in the hands of nobles who distrusted each other and whose interests were not always in harmony. While France was gaining strength, England began to disintegrate internally. A decisive moment was the year 1435, when the House of Burgundy, until then England's most important ally, changed sides. Duke Philip the Good made peace with Charles VII, which meant that England suddenly found itself without the support that had previously given it so much power. This diplomatic turn isolated the English in France and made their position increasingly untenable. From then on, a series of setbacks began for England. French armies, better organized and tarried by a new national enthusiasm, recaptured city after city. The English were pushed back more and more to their remaining bastions. Even their legendary archers could not stop the turnaround because French warfare had changed. They no longer relied on hasty battles, but on sieges, patience, and the constant expansion of their control. Meanwhile, England plunged deeper and deeper into internal conflicts. Henry VI proved to be a weak ruler, plagued by illness and indecision. His inability to hold the empire together later led to the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses, a civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York. But his weakness was already noticeable during the 100 Years' War. England could no longer concentrate its forces and gradually lost the fruits of its earlier victories. France, on the other hand, changed in this phase. A fragmented country full of internal conflicts had become a kingdom that slowly developed a national identity under Charles VII. The memory of Joan of Arc, the unity after the coronation in Reims, and the growing faith in their own king gave the people the strength to beat back the English. The turning point had been reached. It was no longer a question of whether England would dominate France, but how long it could hold its last positions. The 100 Years' War was coming to an end, and the last big decision was to be made at the Battle of Castillon, where the English were finally defeated and a century of fighting came to a bloody conclusion.
Chapter 20. Castillon, 1453. The end of the 100 Years' War and its consequences. The summer of 1453 brought the end of a war that had shaken Europe for more than a century. The English had lost almost everything in France. Their former victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt were only memories, and their dream of conquering the French crown had long since crumbled into ruins. Only a few fortresses in the southwest remained, including Bordeaux and the surrounding area of the Garonne. But even these last bastions were soon to fall. The decisive encounter came at Castillon in July 1453. There, France gathered a modern army that was very different from the armies of earlier decades. The war had changed. While knights and archers dominated at the beginning, cannons and artillery now played a central role. Charles VII had promoted the development of a powerful artillery, and at Castillon, this innovation was to prove decisive. The English, led by John Talbot, one of the last great knights of their empire, tried to drive out the French besieging troops. Talbot, over 70 years old and yet full of fighting spirit, stormed the French camp with his men. But he had no idea that a huge number of cannons were set up there. When the English attacked, they were met by a hail of projectiles that shattered their ranks. The attack collapsed, Talbot himself fell in battle, and his army was crushingly defeated. Castillon ended not only a battle, but an entire era. The English had to withdraw from almost all areas of France. Only Calais remained with them, and that for another 100 years. But the dream of an English king on the throne of France was finally over. France had won, and the 100 Years' War was over. The consequences were profound. For France, the victory meant the consolidation of royal power. Charles VII and his successors were able to take over an empire that emerged stronger from the war. The feudal structures that had long fragmented France increasingly gave way to a centralized monarchy. The national consciousness that had grown through the fighting and through the figure of Joan of Arc made France a united nation. England, on the other hand, entered a phase of uncertainty. The loss of France was not only a political disaster, but also a shock to society. The prestige that the crown had gained through previous victories was gone. Henry VI, the weak and sick king, could not absorb the defeat. Shortly after the end of the war, England plunged into the War of the Roses, a civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York that shook the country for decades. Castillon also had symbolic power militarily. It was a battle that marked the end of classical chivalry. The English longbow, once the weapon that defeated kings, was overtaken by the power of cannons. Artillery had changed the battlefield forever, and the Middle Ages were slowly entering a new era. The 100 Years' War was thus more than just a conflict between two nations. It was a turning point. He created France as a united state. It initiated the transition to a new, turbulent era in England, and he fundamentally changed the conduct of the war. Millions of people had lost their lives in this century of fighting, but the suffering also gave rise to new structures that shaped Europe. When the cannons fell silent at Castillon in the summer of 1453, a war ended that generations had known as if there were no other reality. France was now victorious, England was weakened, and Europe was entering a new era. But the memories of the battles, of Joan of Arc, of the great victories and bitter defeats were to remain alive centuries later. The 100 Years' War was over, but its echo reverberated for a long time.